One of the biggest misconceptions about empaths is this. People assume empaths are endlessly emotional, endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving. And for a while, that's often true. Empaths usually care deeply, not casually, not temporarily, deeply. They notice emotional shifts most people completely overlook. Small changes in tone, small changes in behavior, small moments where something suddenly feels emotionally different. A delayed response, a colder energy, a fake apology, a forced smile, a conversation that suddenly feels emotionally distant. And because empaths naturally try to understand people, they often ignore their own emotional pain for far too long. They excuse toxic behavior, defend emotionally unavailable people, convince themselves that patience will eventually heal the relationship, that more understanding will somehow create emotional safety. So instead of leaving when they first feel hurt, they stay. They explain more, forgive more, try harder, love harder, and slowly their emotional boundaries begin disappearing. This is why many empaths become emotionally exhausted without realizing it, because they spend years emotionally carrying relationships almost alone, trying to keep the peace, trying to avoid conflict, trying to hold emotional connections together while the other person slowly stops putting in the same emotional effort. And over time, that imbalance starts destroying something inside them. Not suddenly, quietly. The empath begins waking up emotionally drained. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel heavy. Being emotionally available starts feeling exhausting instead of natural. Even small interactions begin overwhelming their nervous system. Because deep down, they are tired. Tired of over-explaining their feelings. Tired of feeling emotionally unseen. Tired of constantly giving understanding to people who never truly try to understand them back. And eventually, the empath reaches a psychological breaking point. Not dramatic, silent. A moment where something inside them finally says, I cannot keep abandoning myself just to keep this connection alive. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath emotionally detaches, they rarely reconnect the same way again. People usually think the empath suddenly stopped caring. But the truth is, the empath cared for too long. Long after they felt emotionally exhausted, long after they stopped feeling emotionally safe, long after the relationship started hurting more than healing. That's why empath detachment often feels shocking to other people, because outwardly, the empath may still look calm, still reply politely, still appear emotionally present, but internally, they already started letting go weeks, sometimes months earlier. And once an empath finally reaches that stage, their energy changes completely. They stop chasing clarity, stop begging for consistency, stop trying to force emotional closeness with people who repeatedly make them feel emotionally alone. Not because they stopped loving deeply, but because they finally realized something painful. Caring should not require self-destruction. And once an empath fully understands that, they stop fighting to keep every connection alive. Because eventually, caring starts hurting more than letting go. The line most people cross too late. Most people think empaths leave because of one major betrayal, one huge argument, one devastating moment that suddenly destroys the relationship. But usually, that's not what happens. Empaths rarely leave because of one mistake. They leave after repeated emotional inconsistency, repeated disrespect, repeated emotional neglect that slowly builds over time. The problem is not always what somebody does once. It's what they continue doing after the empath already communicated the pain. That's the line most people cross too late. Because empaths are usually extremely patient communicators. They explain themselves carefully, give warnings gently, try to create emotional understanding before walking away. They say things like, "That hurt me. I don't feel emotionally safe right now. I just need consistency." But many people don't take those moments seriously because the empath stays. They remain calm, still respond, still try, still love. So people assume everything is fine. What they fail to understand is this. An empath staying physically does not always mean they still feel emotionally connected, because every time their emotional needs get ignored, something inside them quietly begins shutting down. Not dramatically, silently. The empath slowly stops feeling emotionally safe around that person. And emotional safety is everything to an empath. Without it, the relationship slowly starts dying internally, even if it still exists physically on the outside. That's why many people become shocked when an empath finally leaves, because outwardly, the empath still looked calm, still answered messages, still showed up, still acted normal. But internally, they had already started grieving the relationship long before leaving it. That's the dangerous part about hurting an empath repeatedly. They rarely explode immediately. They rarely create chaos before walking away. Instead, they emotionally withdraw in silence. First, they stop over-explaining. Then they stop expressing every emotion. Then they stop reaching out as much. Stop trying to repair every emotional disconnect. Stop fighting for the connection alone. And eventually, they stop expecting emotional safety from that person completely. That's usually the moment the relationship quietly ends for them emotionally, even if nobody else notices it yet. Because once an empath realizes their vulnerability is repeatedly being mishandled, their nervous system starts protecting them automatically. And after enough emotional disappointment, the empath begins understanding something painful. Love cannot survive where emotional safety constantly disappears. So by the time people finally realize the empath changed, it's often already too late. Because the empath did not leave suddenly. They left slowly, emotion by emotion, disappointment by disappointment, until eventually there was nothing emotionally left to hold on to anymore. Why empaths tolerate so much before leaving? Empaths usually do not give up easily. In fact, many empaths stay in emotionally draining situations far longer than they should. Why? Because empaths naturally see potential in people. They see pain behind behavior, trauma behind emotional immaturity, fear behind emotional distance, insecurity hidden beneath anger, and loneliness hidden behind coldness. While most people react only to behavior, empaths often try to understand the emotional wound causing the behavior. And because they understand emotions deeply, they often become trapped in unhealthy cycles of over-understanding. They keep making excuses for people who continuously hurt them. Keep believing the relationship will eventually improve. Keep hoping the person will someday communicate better, love better, heal, grow, or become emotionally available. So instead of walking away when they first feel emotionally unsafe, they stay. They explain more, forgive more, sacrifice more. Because deep down, many empaths believe patience can heal emotional distance. But over time, this slowly creates emotional burnout. Because understanding somebody's pain does not remove the emotional damage they continue causing. That realization becomes extremely painful for empaths. Because many of them genuinely believed love meant patience, sacrifice, endurance, staying loyal through emotional difficulty, no matter how exhausted they became internally. So for a long time, they tolerate things they should never have tolerated. Mixed signals, emotional inconsistency, lack of effort, manipulation disguised as confusion, one-sided emotional labor. Not because they are weak, but because they care deeply enough to keep hoping things will change, until eventually something inside them finally breaks emotionally. The empath begins realizing a painful truth. Love should not require abandoning your own peace. Love should not constantly feel emotionally heavy. It should not feel like endless emotional survival. It should not require sacrificing your nervous system just to keep a connection alive. And once that lesson finally sinks in, the empath starts changing internally, quietly. They stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. Stop forcing conversations that never lead anywhere. Stop over-explaining emotions to people committed to misunderstanding them. Because they finally realize genuine connection should not feel one-sided all the time. And once an empath reaches that stage, their energy changes completely. They become calmer, more distant, more emotionally protective. Not because they stopped caring, but because they became tired of giving endless emotional chances to people who never truly valued them. That's usually when the empath begins emotionally detaching, not loudly, quietly. And the dangerous part is, most people do not notice it immediately. Because by the time the empath finally stops trying, they have usually been emotionally exhausted for a very long time already. And once that quiet detachment fully happens, their return becomes very rare. When empaths stop feeling emotionally safe. The moment an empath stops feeling emotionally safe, everything changes psychologically. Because empaths experience emotional environments very intensely. Mixed signals affect them deeply. Inconsistency affects them deeply. Manipulation affects them deeply. Even subtle emotional instability slowly exhausts their nervous system over time. What may seem small to other people often feels emotionally heavy to an empath. A colder tone, delayed affection, passive aggression hidden behind humor, emotional distance that suddenly appears without explanation. Empaths notice all of it, not because they are dramatic, not because they are weak, but because repeated emotional pain trained them to notice danger early. That's why healed empaths become extremely sensitive to emotional patterns. They notice tone changes, energy shifts, inconsistency, emotional dishonesty, behavior that feels emotionally unpredictable. And after enough emotional disappointment, their body begins reacting before their mind fully processes what is happening. That's the part most people don't understand. For many empaths, emotional safety is not just emotional. It becomes physical too. Their nervous system starts feeling tense around emotionally unsafe people. They overthink conversations afterward, feel emotionally drained after small interactions, struggle to fully relax around people who repeatedly create emotional confusion. Because once trust becomes unstable, the empath's nervous system quietly enters survival mode. And eventually, their body stops relaxing around emotionally unsafe people altogether. That's when emotional self-protection begins. The empath becomes quieter, more observant, more emotionally guarded. Not because they became cold, but because their nervous system no longer feels safe opening completely around people who repeatedly hurt them. This is why many healed empaths stop tolerating emotionally inconsistent behavior very quickly. Not out of arrogance, out of awareness. Because they already know what emotional instability eventually turns into. Exhaustion, anxiety, overthinking, emotional burnout. So instead of continuing to chase reassurance, they slowly begin pulling their energy back. They stop over-explaining themselves, stop forcing emotional closeness, stop begging for consistency from people who continuously create confusion. And little by little, their emotional connection begins shutting down internally. Not loudly, quietly. Because once an empath associates someone with emotional instability, their inner world starts protecting itself automatically. That's the shift most people notice too late. The empath may still smile, still talk, still appear emotionally present, but internally, the emotional safety is already gone. And without emotional safety, deep emotional connection cannot survive for long, because eventually peace becomes more important than attachment. And once an empath fully realizes that, they stop choosing people simply because they feel emotionally attached. They begin choosing what feels emotionally safe instead. The one thing empaths never forget. Empaths do not forget how people made them feel emotionally, especially people they genuinely trusted. That's the part many people underestimate, because empaths rarely connect with people on a surface level. When they care deeply. They remember emotional energy, the feeling behind conversations, the emotional atmosphere people created around them. So even when time passes, their nervous system still remembers certain emotional experiences very clearly. The inconsistency, the emotional abandonment, the mixed signals, the moments they felt emotionally invisible beside someone they deeply cared about. An empath may forgive behavior intellectually, but emotionally, their body often still remembers the pain. That's why repeated emotional betrayal affects empaths so deeply. Because they do not experience emotional hurt casually. They absorb it. They replay conversations, analyze situations, question themselves, wonder what changed, wonder why the connection suddenly stopped feeling emotionally safe. And after enough emotional disappointment, something inside them begins changing. Not because they stop believing in love, not because they stop believing in connection, but because they finally understand something life-changing. Emotional access should be earned, not automatically given. That realization completely changes the way many healed empaths approach relationships later in life. They stop being impressed by words, promises, temporary effort, grand emotional speeches that disappear once comfort returns. Instead, they begin paying attention to patterns, emotional consistency, emotional accountability, emotional maturity, emotional safety. Because empaths eventually realize that someone's true emotional character is revealed through repeated behavior, not temporary emotion. That's why healed empaths often become extremely selective later in life. Not cold, selective. They stop attaching themselves to potential. Stop falling in love with who somebody could become someday. Stop trying to emotionally rescue people who continuously create instability. Because repeated pain teaches them something most people never fully understand. Peace is more valuable than emotional intensity. And once an empath has been emotionally damaged enough times, their heart stops responding to fantasy. It starts responding to safety, calm, consistency, emotional stability. That's the shift. The empath no longer asks, "Do I feel emotionally attached to this person?" They begin asking, "Do I feel emotionally safe with this person?" And if somebody repeatedly destroys that peace, the empath never fully forgets it. Not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but because emotional pain leaves deep impressions on emotionally sensitive people. And once an empath spends years rebuilding their inner peace after emotional damage, they become very careful about who they allow close to their heart again. Because mature empaths eventually learn something powerful. The people you love can either become emotional safety or emotional survival. And after enough hurt, the empath finally learns the difference. Why empaths leave silently? Empaths rarely leave loudly. Most leave emotionally long before they leave physically. That's why their silence confuses people. Because outwardly, the empath may still appear completely normal, still polite, still responsive, still emotionally calm on the surface. They may still reply to messages, still show up in conversations, still maintain basic interaction like nothing has changed. But internally, something very different is happening. They are already disconnecting, little by little, emotion by emotion. Because empaths do not process relationships the way most people do. They don't switch off suddenly. They don't explode and walk away instantly. Instead, they grieve relationships internally for a very long time before they ever leave. They replay conversations in their mind. They revisit emotional moments that felt off. They analyze tone changes. They remember broken promises. They notice patterns of inconsistency that others often ignore. And over time, this internal processing becomes heavier and heavier. At first, they try to fix things. They communicate more, explain more, understand more, give more chances. They try to rebuild emotional safety where it started breaking. But when nothing changes, something inside them begins to shift, slowly, not in anger, in exhaustion. By the time an empath becomes distant on the outside, they have already left emotionally on the inside. They are no longer trying to fix the connection, no longer trying to explain themselves, no longer trying to fight for emotional balance that never came. They simply withdraw, quietly. They stop over-explaining, stop over-giving, stop emotionally reaching out first. Stop expecting consistency from people who never provided it. And once that quiet detachment fully forms, there is usually no dramatic exit, no confrontation, no final argument, no emotional explosion, just silence. Because for empaths, silence is not absence of emotion. It is the final stage of emotional exhaustion. They don't leave to punish. They leave to protect what is left of their inner peace. And once an empath reaches that point of deep emotional burnout, Their silence does not come back easily. Sometimes, it never comes back at all. Once they're done, they're gone. When an empath finally stops caring, it's rarely impulsive. It never happens in one sudden moment. It doesn't come from a single argument. It doesn't come from one betrayal alone. It is always something that builds over time. Accumulated emotional pain, accumulated disappointment, accumulated emotional exhaustion. Small moments that looked insignificant to others, but felt heavy to the empath. A feeling of being ignored, misunderstood, emotionally unsupported, repeatedly overlooked. People often assume empaths are weak because they love deeply, because they give chances, because they try to understand instead of reacting immediately. But what most people don't see is this. Empaths tolerate emotional imbalance far longer than most people could survive. They stay, they try, they adjust themselves, they over-explain their feelings, they forgive what hurt them, they keep hoping things will improve. Until one day, something inside them quietly reaches its limit. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. And that is the moment everything changes. Because once an empath reaches their emotional limit, they rarely return the same way again. They may still look the same on the outside, but internally, the connection is already gone. The emotional attachment weakens, the trust fades, the emotional safety disappears, and what replaces it is awareness. A very clear understanding that not every connection deserves unlimited access. Because repeated emotional hurt eventually teaches empaths something life-changing. Not everybody deserves access to your heart. Not everybody deserves your emotional energy, your patience, your understanding, your emotional availability. And once an empath fully learns that lesson, their entire life starts shifting. They stop chasing emotionally unsafe people. Stop forcing consistency from people who never valued their feelings. Stop overgiving in relationships that only drain them. They stop abandoning themselves just to keep someone else comfortable. Because mature empaths eventually realize something deeply powerful. Love that constantly destroys your peace is not love that is meant for you. And at that point, self-respect becomes stronger than emotional attachment. They begin choosing themselves, their peace, their emotional stability, their nervous system. And once that shift happens fully, there is rarely a way back to who they used to be. Because when an empath finally chooses peace over emotional chaos, they don't unlearn it, they protect it. And that is why when empaths are truly done, they're not just gone, they are gone for good.